The wind moved like a restless hand across the New Mexico hills, dragging dust and dry sage over the wide pastures. Evening fell slow, the kind that stretched shadows into long, dark fingers and painted the Harrigan ranch house in copper light. The place stood large against the horizon, 3 stories of timber and stone, built with wealth and pride but empty of laughter. Inside, the silence was thick enough to hear boots echo across polished floors. Colt Harrigan had grown used to it. He sat at the long oak table, untouched supper cooling before him. He wasn't much for eating alone, but habits died slower than men did. His ranch hands were gone back to their quarters, the livestock penned, the day's work folded into quiet. Colt leaned back in his chair, hat tilted low, eyes heavy with the weariness of command. At 42, he had more land than some towns, and more cattle than a man could count in a season, yet his evenings felt hollow, the house echoing like a church long abandoned. The knock came steady, 3 raps against the thick wood door, not timid, not hasty, but with a rhythm that carried patience. Colt straightened. Visitors weren't common after sundown, and those who came uninvited usually meant trouble. He pushed his chair back, boots sounding against the floor, hand brushing the iron revolver holstered at his hip. The second knock came just as he reached the door. When he swung it open, lantern light spilled out across the porch. A woman stood there, shoulders squared, though her frame trembled beneath the weight she carried. She wore a faded calico dress, hem dust-stained from miles of road, and a shawl clutched tight against the cold. Her belly showed full and rounded beneath the fabric, heavy with child. Dark strands of hair had slipped free from her bonnet, and her face, pale from weariness, was sharpened by determination. "Evening," she said, her voice steady though it carried the rasp of dust. "Name's Clara, Clara Mayfield. I heard you might need someone to keep house. I can cook, I can clean, I just need a roof." Colt felt the air catch in his chest. Mayfield. The name landed like a stone tossed into still water, ripples spreading quick and sharp through memory. He masked it well, letting no flicker of recognition reach his face, but the weight of it pressed hard against his ribs. His gaze swept over her worn shoes near split at the seams, calloused hands gripping the shawl, eyes the color of storm clouds with a flicker of something behind them. Not fear, not pleading. Something quieter, hope, maybe, desperation, too, but wrapped in dignity. "You walked here?" Colt asked. "From Silver Creek," she answered. "Had a wagon till the wheel gave out. Sold the mule to pay the doctor." Her hand brushed absently over her belly. "Couldn't stay there. Needed a place where the past won't follow so easy." Colt studied her in the lantern light. He could have turned her away, likely should have. He had no use for strangers, much less ones carrying burdens heavier than their own skin. Yet he found himself shifting against the doorframe, pulled not by logic but by the look in her eyes. The same look he remembered in the mirror long ago, when grief and grit mixed into something a man couldn't quite name. "You can cook?" he asked finally. "Well enough to keep you fed," she said. "And I don't shy from hard work. I'll earn my keep." The silence stretched. Wind rattled the porch boards, dry leaves skittering across the steps. Colt felt the name she'd spoken still sitting sharp in his chest. Mayfield. A name tied to betrayal, to debts never paid. But standing before him was no outlaw, no rival. Just a widow, heavy with child, who'd come to his door with nothing but her word. "Fine," he said at last, voice low as gravel. "One room at the back. You'll rise with the sun and earn your place. Don't think I'll tolerate less." Relief flickered in her eyes, soft as the lantern glow. She nodded once, small and sure. "Thank you, Mr. Harrigan." He stepped aside, letting her cross the threshold. Her boots whispered across the pinewood floor, her hand brushing the wall like she was testing if it was real. For Colt, the silence of the house shifted with her presence, no longer heavy but waiting, like the air before rain. When the door closed behind them, Colt stood for a long moment, the name still echoing in his ears. Clara Mayfield. And though he told himself it was nothing but coincidence, he knew this woman's arrival carried with it a storm he wasn't ready for. The table stretched long and empty, set with more chairs than had been filled in years. Colt Harrigan sat at the head as he always did, broad shoulders casting shadows across the lamplight, a plate before him untouched. He was used to silence at the scrape of his own fork against china, the tick of the clock over the mantel, the hollow of a house too big for one man's life. Tonight was different. Clara moved quiet in the kitchen, the faint clatter of dishes carrying into the dining room. She'd insisted on cooking, even after the day's weary miles had worn her thin. The smell of stew rose rich and earthy, beans simmered with venison and onion, filling corners of the house that hadn't known warmth since before Colt's father died. When she entered, apron tied across her belly, the light followed her in. She set the pot down and ladled food into bowls without ceremony, her hands practiced, her movements steady, though her shoulders sagged with fatigue. Colt watched her, not speaking. He wasn't sure what to do with the presence of another person across the table. His ranch hands ate in their own quarters. Guests didn't come often, and when they didn't linger. Yet here sat a woman carrying more than her own weight, placing bread and stew before him as if the house had always been hers to tend. "Eat," she said softly, almost like it was an order she was used to giving. Colt lifted his spoon but didn't take a bite right away. He studied her instead, the curve of her cheek hollowed by travel, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the small way she breathed before speaking again. "I should introduce myself proper," she said, eyes lifting to meet his. "Clara Mayfield." The name struck like a hammer. Colt's hand froze mid-air, spoon heavy with stew trembling before it dropped back into the bowl with a dull splash. His jaw tightened, breath pulled sharp through his nose. The air seemed to change, thick and close, as though the very walls leaned in to hear what came next. "Mayfield," he repeated, voice flat, low. "Yes," she said, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if she felt the weight behind the word but didn't understand it. "My husband was Thomas Mayfield. He's been gone near a year now." Colt's gaze darkened. Thomas wasn't the name he knew, but the surname was enough to light up a trail of memories he'd buried deep. Years ago, he had trusted a man named Elias Mayfield, a partner in cattle drives, a man who'd shared whiskey by the fire and handshakes over profits, until the betrayal. Until the contracts rewritten in shadows, the herd lost in a scheme that had nearly broken Harrigan land. Colt had pulled himself back through grit and gun, but the wound had never healed. "Elias Mayfield ever mean anything to you?" Colt asked, tone sharp as a blade. Clara blinked. "No, not to my knowing. My Thomas was a miner, not a cattleman. Never spoke of an Elias." Colt leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His eyes stayed fixed on her, searching for any flicker of deceit. He found none, only exhaustion, grief, and the steady flame of a woman too proud to beg. "I reckon that name carries history," Clara said carefully, sensing the storm in him. "It does," Colt muttered. He shoved a spoonful of stew into his mouth as though the act itself could push the past back down. The taste was good, seasoned right, but it sat heavy on his tongue. They ate in silence for a stretch. The crackle of the hearth filling the space words might have held. Colt's thoughts churned. The Mayfield name was a scar he didn't want reopened, but here it was, sitting across from him with steady gray eyes and an unborn child stirring beneath her ribs. Clara finally set down her spoon, folding her hands over her belly. "I didn't come here to stir old ghosts, Mr. Harrigan. I came because I need work, and because this child needs a place in the world. Whatever trouble that name once brought you, it ain't mine to carry." Her words hung in the air, soft but firm. Colt studied her a long moment. She wasn't lying. He knew liars, they shifted, they fidgeted, they couldn't hold your gaze. Clara Mayfield looked at him like a woman who'd stood at gravesides and didn't flinch from the truth. Colt let out a long breath, shoulders easing though the tension didn't leave entirely. "You'll earn your keep here," he said finally. "But don't expect me to forget that name anytime soon." I wouldn't ask you to, she replied. The lamp hissed faintly as the flame adjusted, shadows dancing across the timber walls. Colt lifted his cup, drank deep, and set it down with a thud. He told himself it was coincidence, nothing more. But as he watched Clara gather the bowls and carry them back to the kitchen, he knew better. Names had power, and hers had just unsettled the quiet he'd fought years to keep. The Harrigan ranch house was too big for one man, and Clara felt it the moment her footsteps crossed the threshold. The floors stretched wide and polished, but the sound of her boots echoed like whispers in a church. The hallways, lined with tall windows and heavy drapes, seemed built to remind a person how small they were. Yet she moved through it with quiet purpose, sleeves rolled, hands steady, her belly heavy but not slowing her down. By the second morning she had scrubbed the hearth, swept out corners that had gathered dust like secrets, and opened windows to let in air that smelled of sage and sun. She cooked with what little was stored in the pantry: biscuits, beans, salted pork, and turned them into meals that made the house smell like it had been lived in once upon a time. Bread rose on the kitchen counter, its yeasty warmth filling the air, while a pot of venison stew simmered on the stove. The scent carried down the hallways, pressing into rooms that hadn't seen comfort in years. Colt noticed. He didn't say much, didn't linger when she worked, but she caught him watching from doorways. He'd stand with his hat in hand, eyes shadowed, as though trying to measure whether this presence in his home was a comfort or a threat. When she looked up, he would clear his throat and move along, boots heavy against the boards. At night the house still felt hollow. Clara would lie on the narrow bed in the back room, her hand resting on the curve of her stomach, listening to the wind press against the shutters and the faint creak of the timbers settling. Somewhere down the hall, Colt's boots would sound once or twice before all fell silent again. She wondered what rooms he slept in, which walls he stared at when the nights stretched too long. During the day she worked without complaint, her belly pulled at her back, and sometimes she paused to catch her breath, one hand braced against the table. But she refused to let him see weakness. She washed linens until her knuckles turned raw, mended curtains with thread so fine her eyes burned by lamplight. She polished the long oak table until it gleamed, then set it with plates that hadn't been touched in years. The house began to change under her touch, not in great leaps but in small, steady ways. One evening, Colt found her in the parlor dusting the mantel. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. She didn't notice him at first, humming low under her breath, some tune so soft it was more memory than music. When she finally turned, startled to see him there, her cheeks flushed faintly. "You don't need to do all this," he said. His voice was low, but not unkind. Her eyes met his. "I do," she answered simply. "A house dies if it's left alone too long. I reckon a man does too." Colt didn't reply, but the words lingered with him long after he walked away. He felt them in the quiet of his own room, in the way the air carried her bread's warmth instead of dust. By the week's end, the Harrigan house no longer stood silent like a tomb. The long halls still echoed, but now, with the scrape of chairs, the clatter of dishes, the faint rhythm of a woman's footsteps carrying life where it had been absent. Colt told himself he kept his distance out of caution, but each time he passed a doorway and caught sight of Clara bent over her work, steady and sure despite her condition, he felt something shift. The edges of the place softened, and though he didn't say it aloud, Colt knew it was no longer just his house. It was beginning, piece by piece, to feel like a home again. The sun sat high and sharp, spilling heat over the yard until the stones near the well shimmered. Clara knelt in the small garden patch behind the Harrigan house, hands buried in dry soil. The rose had been half forgotten, weeds grown wild between the onions and carrots that clung stubborn in the dirt. She worked slowly, her dress pulled tight over her belly, sweat dampening the hair along her temples. A basket lay beside her with a few sprigs of herbs and a handful of beans, not much, but enough to season the evening meal. Colt leaned against the fence a short distance off, hat low over his brow. He'd come to check the rails, but his hands stilled when he saw her kneeling there. Something about the picture caught him, the widow bent in the earth like she belonged to it, her shadow short and solid against the ground. He didn't announce himself right away, just watched as she pulled a stubborn weed, wiped her palms on her skirt, and sat back to catch her breath. The silence of the afternoon pressed around them until she finally spoke without looking up. "This child 'll never know his father." Her voice was even, but the words cut the air like a blade. Colt's hand tightened on the fence post. He waited, letting her go on. "Thomas worked the Clifton mine. He was good with his hands, not afraid of dark places. Said the work would keep us fed." She paused, eyes on the soil she had just turned over. "One morning he didn't come back. They told me a beam cracked and came down fast. Said there was nothing to be done. But I've known men who dig their whole lives. They can smell when a tunnel's ready to give. Thomas wasn't careless." She looked toward the horizon then, where the ridges cut against the sky in jagged teeth. Her voice dropped low. Before it happened, he'd been arguing with a foreman. Names got tossed around: Keller, Voss, men who weren't miners but carried ledgers and contracts. Thomas said they were cutting corners, pushing deeper where the ground was soft. He said they cared more for silver than safety. That was the week he died. The names struck Colt like a cold wind. Keller, Voss. He knew them, or men like them, faces from saloons where deals were written on whiskey-stained paper, men tied to the Dry Creek Syndicate. Years back, they'd tried to strip him of grazing land through debts and false claims. He'd nearly lost everything before he fought his way free. To hear those names again, on her lips, made his gut clench. Clara smoothed the earth over the roots she'd planted, her fingers trembling just slightly. "They paid me nothing, said the accident was his fault. By the time the dust settled, I had debts instead of wages. The mule was gone, the wagon too. All I had left was his name." She lifted her chin, eyes meeting Colt's for the first time. "Mayfield don't open doors, it closes them." Colt held her gaze, the silence between them thick. He wanted to tell her what he knew, that Keller and Voss weren't just careless men but vultures, tied to an outfit that thrived on ruin. That Thomas Mayfield might have been silenced as much as killed. But the words stayed locked behind his teeth. He wasn't ready to put his ghosts on the table. Not yet. Instead, he stepped closer, the boards of the fence groaning under his weight. "A garden grows if you keep at it," he said gruffly, though his eyes lingered on her longer than his words allowed. Clara gave a faint smile, small but real, and lowered her gaze back to the soil. The sun pressed down, hot and steady, but for the first time in a long while, the air between them felt like it carried more than silence. It carried truth. And for Colt Harrigan, truth was a dangerous thing because it meant the past he'd buried wasn't finished with him yet. The night lay heavy over the Harrigan ranch, the kind of quiet that sharpened every sound: the tick of the old clock in the parlor, the low hiss of the lamp, the restless creak of beams settling against the wind. Colt sat at the table with a ledger spread before him, pencil scratching as he tallied cattle counts, though his mind wandered more than the numbers admitted. Across the hall, he heard Clara moving. Light footsteps, the soft clink of china being stacked, then nothing. He didn't look up until she appeared in the doorway. Her shawl was pulled tight around her shoulders, her face pale in the lamplight. She carried something in her hand, folded and worn, paper that looked as though it had been gripped too many times by worried fingers. "I should have shown you this sooner," she said quietly. Colt pushed the ledger aside and gestured for her to sit. She hesitated, then lowered herself into the chair opposite him. Her hand trembled as she laid the paper flat between them. He could see the creases, darkened with sweat and dirt, the edges torn as if it had been shoved into pockets in haste. He unfolded it carefully. The words were scrawled in ink that had bled faintly with time but still bit hard into the page. "Mrs. Mayfield, the land your late husband left is not yours to keep. Payment is past due. Vacate before spring or face consequence." It was unsigned, but at the bottom was a mark. A crude stamp in red wax. Colt knew it before his mind finished naming it. Dry Creek Syndicate. His jaw locked, the muscles along it twitching. He read the letter twice, slow, steady, as if the second pass might change the words. It didn't. When he finally lifted his eyes, Clara was watching him, searching his face. "You recognize it?" she said, not asking but stating. Colt leaned back, rubbing a hand over his mouth. "I do." She swallowed, her hand settling protectively over the swell of her belly. "They've been circling since Thomas died. A man came once, wearing a fine coat, said the mine debts carried my husband's name, and by law that meant they carried mine too. I told him I had nothing, that all I had was a patch of land not worth the dust on his boots. He smiled, said sometimes land was worth more than gold, if you knew where to look." Colt shut his eyes a moment, breath low, steadying. He remembered that same kind of smile, years ago, when Elias Mayfield Dam, that name, had sold him out to Dry Creek, nearly stripping him of grazing rights that had belonged to Harrigans for 3 generations. Only grit and a well-timed rifle shot in a courtroom alley had kept Colt on his land. He'd thought he left those vultures behind, thought they'd bled him once and moved on. But here they were again, circling through Clara, her unborn child, a softer target. "Clara," he said slowly, the weight in his voice heavier than the air itself. "These men don't just take land, they take lives. They squeeze until there's nothing left but dust. Your husband, he didn't die in no accident, not if their names were tied to it." Her lips parted, but no words came. She looked down at the paper, her thumb smoothing the crease as though by touch alone she might erase it. "I feared as much," she whispered. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint whistle of wind through the chimney. Colt's eyes stayed fixed on her, not with suspicion now, but with something harder, something protective. He hadn't asked for this widow to step across his threshold, hadn't asked for her ghosts to stir his own. Yet, here she sat, carrying danger into his house the way others might carry a basket of bread. He folded the letter and slid it back across the table. "You're not facing this alone anymore," he said, voice rough. Her eyes flicked up, startled by the certainty in his tone. "You'd risk yourself for a woman you hardly know?" He leaned forward, elbows braced on the table, gaze steady as a drawn gun. "I know enough. I know the stamp on that letter. I know the men behind it. And I know if they've marked you, they won't stop till they've got what they came for, which means standing by while you're hunted ain't an option." Clara stared at him a long moment, her breath uneven. Finally she nodded, a small motion but firm. "Then what do we do?" Colt glanced toward the darkened window, where the land stretched endless and waiting under the moon. He didn't have the full answer yet, but one truth burned clear as the lamp between them. The past he'd buried was back, wearing new clothes, and this time it wasn't just his fight. This time, it was hers too. The first flakes came at dusk, small and harmless as ash. Clara had just finished covering the garden with burlap when the wind shifted, carrying the sharp bite of winter across the hills. By nightfall the sky was a sheet of gray and white, and the storm arrived with a fury that rattled the shutters and howled down the chimneys like wolves baying at the door. Inside, the Harrigan house groaned beneath the weight of it. The old timbers creaked, and the glass panes shook in their frames. Clara moved from window to window, checking the latches while the lamp in her hand flickered with each gust. She had lived through storms before, but never in a house so vast. Each echo made her feel small, each whistle through the cracks like a voice reminding her how alone they were in miles of snow. Colt hauled extra wood to the hearth, the sleeves of his shirt rolled, his movements steady despite the cold that pressed through every seam. When the fire finally caught, it roared with a heat that banished the shadows to the corners. He wiped the frost from his brow, turned, and found Clara watching him. "You'll freeze if you keep running the halls," he said, his voice low but not sharp. "Best sit." She hesitated, then crossed the room and lowered herself into the rocking chair near the fire. The light painted her cheeks pink, caught the sheen of damp hair curling at her temples. For a moment she simply sat, both hands cupped over the swell of her belly, listening to the storm hammer the world outside. Colt dropped into the chair opposite, stretching his legs out, boots heavy against the rug. The silence between them lingered until she broke it. "This house of yours is too quiet." Colt gave a faint grunt, eyes fixed on the flames. "Quiet keeps a man sane. Or it keeps him alone," she said gently. Her words hung in the air. He didn't answer right off, only shifted in his seat. His eyes softened, though, when they flicked her way. The firelight showed more than he usually allowed, the lines etched deep from years of command, the wear of a man who'd carried burdens without sharing them. Clara leaned back, the rocker creaking beneath her. "Thomas used to tell stories during storms, said it kept the dark from listening in." Her gaze dipped to the fire. "I don't have many stories worth telling now." Colt studied her, the faint tremor in her voice, betraying what her posture tried to hide. "Then I'll tell one." He spoke of his father, of long cattle drives under skies so wide they swallowed a man whole. Of nights when the herd stampeded, and a boy too young to shave rode hard with his father's voice echoing in his ear. "Steady hands, Colt, always steady hands." His tone was quiet, almost reluctant, but as the story unwound, Clara's eyes stayed fixed on him, and the walls of the Harrigan house seemed to ease their grip. When he finished, she smiled faintly. "You don't talk much, but when you do, it's worth hearing." Colt looked away, uncomfortable with the warmth those words stirred. "Storm's long," he muttered. "Best to fill it with something." She chuckled softly, then winced as the child shifted beneath her ribs. Colt leaned forward instinctively, concern flickering across his features. Clara waved it off, her hand smoothing her belly. "Just reminding me he's there," she whispered. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind roared, but inside the air thickened with something quieter, trust, tentative and fragile. Colt saw the tired strength in her eyes, the way she carried her burdens without complaint. Clara saw the loneliness in him, heavy as the storm, yet softened tonight by the simple act of sharing space, of telling truth by firelight. Neither spoke of it, but both felt the shift. For the first time, the house wasn't too quiet. The storm raged on, but inside, warmth settled between them like something beginning to grow. Morning light poured soft and gold across the Harrigan ranch, but the air still carried the bite of the storm that had passed. Snow clung in patches along the fences. The noon sun glared hard over the main street of Las Cruces, its heat bouncing off clapboard walls and dusted windows. Wagons creaked along the rutted road, horses stamped and snorted against hitching rails, and townsfolk moved about with the weary rhythm of people who knew life could change in the blink of a gunshot. That rhythm broke when 3 riders appeared at the far end of town. Their coats were too fine for trailmen, boots polished, hats pressed clean. They moved slow, deliberate, like they wanted everyone to see them. Colt Harrigan was standing outside the mercantile, checking the delivery slip for feed sacks he'd ordered when he spotted them. He knew before they even reined up in front of the saloon. The red wax seal on the folded packet, one of them carried, glinted against the sun. Dry Creek Syndicate. The sight of it made his jaw tighten. The lead rider swung down first. He was tall, with a trimmed beard and a smile practiced for courtrooms rather than campfires. He stepped up onto the saloon's porch, unfolded the paper, and called out loud enough for half the town to hear. "By authority vested through contracts and debts unpaid, we come to collect from Mrs. Clara Mayfield. Land, holdings, and claims attached to her name and her unborn child are hereby forfeited until the sum is settled in full." The words rippled through the crowd. Shopkeepers leaned out of doorways, a blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Women paused with baskets mid-air. Inheritance, unborn child. The talk buzzed like angry bees. Clara herself was across the street, having come with Colt for flour and thread. She froze, one hand instinctively covering her belly, eyes wide. Colt crossed the road in 3 long strides. He planted himself between Clara and the syndicate man, voice rough as gravel. That paper's worth less than the ink on it. The rider smirked, waving it with a flourish. All debts are binding, Mr. Harrigan, even those a widow prefers to forget. You know the law. I know when the law's been twisted, Colt shot back. He took the paper from the man's hand before he could react and scanned it, his eyes darkening. These signatures are false, witnesses long dead. You think the folks here can't read? Murmurs rose around them. Old man Thatcher, who ran the stables, spat in the dirt. Dry Creek's been forging deeds since '79. Ain't nothing new. The syndicate man's smile faltered, but only for a second. He leaned in close enough that Colt could smell the cologne masking trail dust. You've got a reputation for standing in the way, Harrigan. Careful you don't end up like your father, buried beneath debts and dust. Colt's hand twitched near his belt. His voice, low but carrying, cut through the air. You want to threaten me. Do it honest. Don't hide behind lies and unborn children. He turned to the gathered townsfolk, raising the forged paper high. This is what they bring. Stolen ink, empty claims, and they'll come for every man and woman here if they get away with it once. The crowd stirred louder now, anger simmering. The syndicate men exchanged glances, realizing the tide had turned against them. The leader mounted back up, his smile gone cold. This isn't finished, he said, voice sharp. You've bought yourself a day, Harrigan. Maybe two, but we'll be back with force enough to make your stand look foolish. They wheeled their horses and rode out, dust rising in their wake like smoke from a fire not yet lit. The street slowly exhaled, tension loosening though unease clung heavy. Men muttered about rifles needing oiling. Women ushered children back inside. Ranch hands along the boardwalk whispered about gunfights, about land wars they thought belonged to an older time but might be coming back fast. Colt stood in the center of it all, the paper still crumpled in his hand, his eyes hard as stone. Clara stepped beside him, her face pale but steady. They won't stop, she said quietly. No, Colt replied, his voice steady though the weight in it was clear. They won't, which means neither can we. The crowd drifted off, whispers trailing behind like shadows. But the feeling remained that something had shifted. The West had seen blood spilled over cattle, over water, over gold. Now it would be over Clara Mayfield's name, and the child she carried. And Colt Harrigan knew he would fight to his last breath to keep both safe. The night was still when it began, so still that the crickets seemed to hush before the first crackle. Colt woke to the faint smell of smoke and the restless whinny of horses carrying through the cold air. He swung his legs from the bed, boots hitting the floor hard, and by the time he stepped onto the porch, the fire was already alive, orange tongues licking high into the dark sky, swallowing the roof of the south cattle barn. Shouts erupted from the bunkhouse. Ranch hands stumbled into the yard, half-dressed, some grabbing buckets, others rifles. The blaze roared with a hunger no man could quench fast enough, and through the shimmer of heat Colt saw shadows on horseback, darting beyond the fence line. Dry Creek had come. He ran for the rifle kept by the door. The stock was familiar in his grip, the weight of it grounding him as the world spun into chaos. Clara appeared at his side, shawl thrown over her nightdress, her eyes wide but steady. The barn, she gasped, but her gaze lifted beyond Ido, the riders circling like wolves. They'll drive the herd if we don't stop them, Colt said. His voice was calm, though his chest thundered. I'll not hide while they burn us out, Clara replied. She had no weapon, only the iron resolve of a woman who had already lost too much. She grabbed a lantern from the porch and held it like a shield. The first shot rang out, snapping through the night. Colt answered with his rifle, the crack echoing off the hills. One rider wheeled back, clutching his arm. Another charged, firing wild, bullets sparking against stone. Clara moved with him, dragging water buckets toward the flames, even as her face flushed red from the heat. When a fallen beam blocked the way, she seized a long-handled rake and shoved it aside, her body trembling but unyielding. Stay back from the heat, Colt barked, firing again into the dark. I won't, she snapped back, her voice cutting sharper than the gunfire. This is my fight too. Their eyes met for only a second, but it was enough. Colt saw at the steel beneath her weariness, the fire that had carried her across miles of desert with nothing but grief and a child inside her. He turned, reloaded, and fired again. His stance solid, not just for his land anymore, but for the woman who stood beside him. The flames climbed higher, throwing light across the yard. Clara's shawl had slipped, her hair whipping loose as she hauled another bucket. Sparks rained around her, but she pressed forward, determined. The firelight painted her not as a widow desperate for refuge, but as something fiercer, someone claiming a place worth protecting. The Dry Creek men saw the resolve standing against them and faltered. Their plan had been to burn and scatter, to send fear ahead of their claims. Instead, they faced a ranch alive with resistance. Colt dropped another rider from his horse, and the rest pulled back, retreating into the shadows with curses swallowed by the roar of the fire. When the last hoofbeats faded, Colt lowered his rifle. The barn was half gone, the roof caving in, but the blaze was contained. Smoke stung his lungs as he turned and found Clara still standing, lantern in hand, her face streaked with soot. Her chest rose and fell, but her eyes were clear. You should have stayed inside, he said, though his voice was softer than he meant. She shook her head. I stayed inside once before, waiting on men to save what was mine. I won't do it again. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire crackled low, collapsing into embers. Around them, the ranch hands murmured, shaken but alive. And in that glow, Colt saw the truth as plain as the smoke rising into the sky. This wasn't just about land anymore. Not debts or contracts or even pride. It was about family hard-earned, unexpected, bound not by blood, but by choice. Clara, her unborn child, the ranch itself, all of it was his to defend. He reached out, his hand brushing her soot-streaked arm, grounding them both. She didn't pull away. The battle had begun, and it would not end easy, but Colt Harrigan knew one thing with certainty. He would burn before he let Dry Creek take them. The days after the fire passed in a blur of smoke-stained dawns and long, weary evenings. The south barn was half gone, its timbers blackened and smoldered down to bones, but the herd was safe, and so was the ranch. Dry Creek had slunk back into the shadows, their threats swallowed by the rising anger of a town tired of being pushed. Men who had once kept quiet now rode out to stand guard along fence lines. Women brought food, bandages, strong words. What had been Harrigan's fight alone became something larger, stitched together by loyalty and defiance. Clara watched it unfold from the porch, one hand braced against the post, the other resting against the swell of her belly. She saw the way neighbors tipped their hats to Colt now, not out of fear but respect. She heard their promises, if they come back they'll face all of us, and felt something in her chest loosen. For the first time in too long, she wasn't standing against the world by herself. The night the lanterns came, it felt almost like a dream. Families from town rode in quietly, bringing small glass lamps and hanging them on fence posts, on the porch rail, along the gate. One by one, tiny flames flickered to life until the Harrigan Ranch glowed across the prairie like a beacon. Clara stood in the doorway, the light catching her face, softening the lines of exhaustion. Beside her, Colt said nothing, but his throat worked as he swallowed hard. When her time finally came, the house held its breath. A storm pounded outside, wind howling against the shutters, but inside the fire burned hot and steady, and Colt never left her side. Hours stretched into eternity, broken only by Clara's sharp cries and the steady encouragement of the midwife who had come at dawn. Colt's big hand stayed wrapped around hers, knuckles white, heart pounding like a war drum. He had faced gunfire, betrayal, fire, and loss, but nothing had ever shaken him like watching Clara fight to bring life into the world. When at last the infant's cry pierced the storm, the walls themselves seemed to exhale. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, tears sliding down her soot-smeared cheeks, sweat dampening her hair. The midwife placed the tiny, wriggling bundle against her chest. Clara's arms folded around him, as if they had been made for nothing else. Colt stared, breath caught in his throat. The baby's fist clenched and unclenched, his voice raw and new. Clara looked up at Colt, her eyes shining despite her exhaustion. "Benjamin," she whispered. Benjamin Colt Mayfield. The name fell into the room like a vow, binding two broken histories into something whole. Colt sank onto the edge of the bed, his hand trembling as he touched the boy's cheek. He had never imagined his name tied to a Mayfield, yet, hearing it now, spoken by Clara, it felt less like a scar and more like a healing. Days later, when the storm had passed and the sky was sharp and clear, Colt carried a chair onto the porch. Clara followed, wrapped in a shawl, the newborn tucked in her arms. They sat side by side as dusk gathered, watching lanterns flicker against the rails, the smell of fresh bread and wood smoke drifting from the kitchen. For years this house had been his fortress, his burden, his silence. Tonight it was different. The halls no longer echoed hollow, they carried footsteps, laughter, the soft murmur of a lullaby. Colt glanced at Clara, her face softened by the glow, her hair loose around her shoulders. She met his gaze without fear, without hesitation. There was no need for grand speeches. The truth was in the quiet, in the way their hands brushed on the armrest, in the warmth that settled over them as the prairie stretched wide and waiting. The Harrigan Ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs. Alive with light, with laughter, with a promise that tomorrow would not be fought alone. And for the first time in years, Colt Harrigan felt the word he had been missing press steady against his heart. Home.